We are honored today to also have with us an expert on intellectual property, my colleague Caroline Ncube. She's a professor of law and she specializes on intellectual property. She holds what we call in South Africa a research chair on intellectual property and innovation and development. She has a PhD from the University of Cape Town in law and a LLM from Cambridge University. She has published extensively on intellectual property and has a book on intellectual property law, intellectual property policy, law and administration in Africa. So I'm going to ask Caroline, who has been listening intently, I guess, to all the discussions that have taken place so far, and she's been keeping her eye on the chat as well, to come in and share some of her insights on how should we respond to the regulatory challenges that colleagues have raised in the discussion so far, and how does she think the current this debate on the vaccine to provide access and affordability to African countries, what does she think can be done to address that? And how can the CFTA help to address some of these challenges? So, Caroline, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues and everyone. It has indeed been fascinating to listen to the insights that we've had so far. And like Faisal has said, I've been keeping my eye on the question and answer. And so I was very excited to see what Kwaku and Susan had to say. So they've raised IP-related questions, and I'm going to weave them into my remarks. So my role this afternoon is a role that I love to play. It's a role that segues into discussion. So I want to partially respond to what the panelists have said, and then also to start to rev up, if you like, the discussion that is going to follow. And I want to respond in a way that's very specific to intellectual property. And what I wanted to do with this then is to ask, from an intellectual property perspective, how can the AfCFTA, and in particular, the projected IP protocol, actually address some of the issues about pharmaceutical value chains and health resilience that have been raised this afternoon. So as we all know, intellectual property is really important in this context because it would serve as a non-tariff barrier to trade. And really, I've heard a lot from the panelists as they spoke about regional approaches, about leveraging Africa's strength so that we don't rely on minimal imports, as Daniela said, being sourced by one country, how we can actually leverage cooperation. So I want to speak a bit about that. But before I speak about that, I wanted to make a few remarks on the intellectual property protocol itself, like what its promise is, what its potential is. And just reading policy discussions over the past year, following social media discussions about this, I have come to the realization that a lot of us have got a lot of dreams, visions, what we hope the IP protocol is going to achieve. And I just wanted to make a few remarks about the strictures around those visions, around that promise and that potential, if you like. So I wanted to start by saying that, of course, the IP protocol is one in a package of 7, right? So we know the first 3 were dealt with, some are not yet complete in stage 1. We know that we're going to have a stage 2 where we're going to deal with investment, with competition, e-commerce and intellectual property. So the first thing I wanted to say is, although for people like me in IP, we tend to think that IP is the all, right? It's the most important. It is not. It is part of a package. So whatever we think that the IP protocol or IP in itself might help with regard to value chains and health resilience, we've got to think of it as part of a package of all of these things. And so the protocol then, the IP protocol, is going to follow the template that the other protocols have laid so far, the first 3. So we know that its structure is going to be similar to the structure of the 3 protocols that are out. We know that its institutions are going to comply with that template. So we know already that in the first 3 protocols, goods, for example, that there is a committee. So we know that the institution that will be created by the IP protocol is going to be a committee on IP. And we also know that the IP protocol is going to be driven by the principles that drive the entire AfCFTA. So those principles like variable geometry are all going to matter. So that's just some thoughts about what the IP protocol, the shape it might take. And then the second thing I then wanted to speak about is once we have some certainty about its structure, its shape, what about its substance? What can it do? And I think that the word Susan used in the question and answer was perhaps reboot, repurpose, revive. I don't have cut my eye on the Q&A at the moment, Susan, but I think you used a word along those lines. And so I wanted to say here again that the IP protocol comes into a regulatory framework that is to some extent set. So all AU member states will have some national IP institutions and law in place. It could be individual to the country. It could be within a region if you're an OWAPI member state, because in OWAPI there is a singular or unified intellectual property system. But whatever the case is, in all AU member states, there is a national IP regime. To add to that layer, there are already regional arrangements as well through the IP organizations and through the regional economic communities. And ultimately, we know that there is an international framework. There are many, many treaties that deal with the substance of intellectual property law. But as Faisal just spoke about now, perhaps the most important would be the TRIPS agreement, because then it is binding on all WTO member states. Again, I've got to pause and say not all AU member states are a party to the TRIPS agreement. They are not yet WTO member states. And so the point I'm trying to make is the IP protocol comes into this place substantively where there are layers and layers and layers of regulation already. And so it's got to navigate the space carefully and carve out some space for it. So having said that, then where do I think that the IP protocol can take us and how can it help with the issue that we're speaking about today? So I think that the IP protocol obviously has a lot of room to take up in the area where we have flexibilities. And Faisal spoke quite strongly about the Doha decision. We have the TRIPS amendment, and we have today and tomorrow historic discussions that again Susan raised in the Q&A about this waiver that is being discussed there. So the IP protocol can come into places like that where there is policy space, where we need a voice, a singular voice, I think, coming from Africa to address some of these matters. So I think that there's a very key role that the IP protocol can play with regard to policy coherence, to direction, and to filling gaps as they exist. And then just to very quickly address the waiver discussion that's going on today. I don't have enough time to unpack it, but perhaps to just give a 30-second summary of what it would be about. So India and South Africa have laid a proposal before WTO member states to say that the pandemic that has gripped the world in this past year is indeed, unforeseen. We need to take revolutionary steps to address it. And we've had conversations in both the chat and the Q&A about intellectual property as proprietary interests that might stop certain things that countries might feel need to be done in emergency situations. And so this is precisely what the waiver is about. India and South Africa are proposing that WTO member states adopt this waiver that is going to address not only patent law, but copyright, trade secrets, industrial designs. So it's not just patents, it's all of these IP rights that would be relevant. And they're asking that WTO members consider waiving those rights in as far as they would be pertinent to resolving the COVID-19 pandemic, in as far as they would assist with getting pharmaceutical products out, with getting medical devices out. So this is the proposal. The basis of the proposal would be Article 73 of the TRIPS agreement, which is the security exception. So we will watch, all of us, very carefully and very excitedly to see what WTO member states have to say about this. I wanted to link this then to the IP protocol and what the continent can do. So we've got South Africa, one AU member with India taking this forward. I would say that the IP protocol should and ought to provide a platform on the continent for AU member states to actually sit down and discuss IP standards and consolidate a common African position. And so if this was happening after the IP protocol was passed, I would have hoped that the IP protocol would have provided a platform where AU member states can discuss these matters and then move forward onto the international plane as a single voice. This is not to say that it is not happening. It is happening. We know that AU member states often speak as a bloc, the African group at the WTO or at the World Intellectual Property Organization. But my sense there is that they tend to caucus in Geneva when there are meetings of these organizations, and they get together and formulate positions. So in my mind, what the AfCFTA's IP protocol would do would be to provide a platform here on the continent for AU member states to discuss these and other matters on the continent, and then go forward and put them forward. So I'm thinking about home ground discussions that would involve national ministries and departments rather than Geneva-based meetings of AU member states representatives. So that's what I think might be a role. And then maybe to finish off with a very specific example. So I've said that the protocol, I think, would provide a space for policy discussions, the consolidation of common African positions to take forward. I just wanted to talk perhaps about the substantive, because earlier on I said that substantively there's already a lot of regulation in the IP space, and so perhaps there's not too much flexibility, but there are gaps. We know there are gaps. A lot of attendees this afternoon, well, some have been posting comments and questions about traditional knowledge to the extent that it would be relevant in the pharmaceutical industry to generate some of these solutions that we're looking for. So we know that at the World IP Organization, there has not yet been a decision about a normative standard, a global standard about how to protect traditional knowledge. Today, we're talking, of course, about traditional medicinal knowledge, but I've just said that there's a gap internationally. So I would imagine that the IP protocol might take some leadership and say, okay, on the continent, this is how we're going to deal with traditional knowledge. There are already instruments. So ARIPO already has a protocol on traditional knowledge, but of course that would be only relevant to ARIPO member states. And so I think that there is still scope and space for an AU approach. But before I go too further down that path, I want to come back and talk about pharmaceutical value chains and go back to that idea about regional cooperation and leveraging our strength as AU member states as a group within a region rather than tackling matters nationally. So I would say, for example, when we come to intellectual property, we might start to talk about exhaustion of rights. So we have 3 schemes of exhaustion of rights. So you can say nationally, if your country adopts a national exhaustion principle, you would say if a product, a pharmaceutical product or medical device has been sold lawfully within the national market, the patent holder loses their right to control further distribution, and then you can do what you like in the national space. That's really limited. What would be more open would be a regional exhaustion principle that says once something is sold once or imported into the region, then it can move freely through the region. I think this might be very useful when we want to leverage the buying power of some AU member states within a region. You get it into the region via one country and then you spread it. And then ultimately the most open one would be international exhaustion that says if it's sold anywhere in the world, then it can go wherever. So I would say that the IP protocol might have some guidance, for example, for AU member states on which exhaustion principle to take, and this is perfectly legitimate because the TRIPS agreement itself doesn't actually dictate to member states what they should do, so it's open. So that's one very specific thing that could be done in the IP protocol. And then I had a number of notes here about the waiver discussion, but I think I've already spoken to that, and I think perhaps this would be a good point to move on to the broader discussion. And I'm hoping that the panelists will pick up some of the questions that I've started to engage with. And perhaps just to close off by saying that I think that the IP protocol has a lot of potential, a lot of promise. It's going to allow the continent to cohere its policies around many things, specifically pharmaceutical value chains, as we're speaking about this afternoon, and that we need to leverage those policy gaps and regulatory gaps that exist.
Prof, do you want to tell us what, in a word, do you think is the way forward for this group?
Okay, I'm just going to be naughty and give you 3 words and not one.
Yes. Yes.
Context, coordination, Coherence. So I think as our negotiators go forward to negotiate this protocol, they need to think very carefully about our context, the African continent. They also need to think about IP within the context of a trade agreement. Coordination, to coordinate regional hubs, see how IP law and policy can assist in those endeavors. And then coherence. We've got to be sure that the IP protocol provides us with guidance to come up with a coherent IP policy. And my last phrase is national action. Whatever we put in this IP protocol is not going to be worth the ink that's been used to write it if there is no national action.